Game over, man. Game over. Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for June 17th, 2024, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy, also known as Sadness.
Also known as Sadness. I'm just emotions all around.
You're
That is
every
me.
emotion. You're
I'm
every emotion.
emotion. In fact, the subtitle of this podcast is Emotions the Podcast.
That's basically what it is. Therapy session, the podcast.
Therapy session, the
yeah.
podcast.
Yeah,
Yes.
for those watching on YouTube, I am wearing blue, so I am representing Sadness right now.
There you go.
Well, yeah, and of course, I think I alluded to this on our main show just yesterday. My wife is traveling to Europe right now for 2 weeks, so it's a little lonely in the Cassidy household right now.
Yeah, well, we will do this together then. We'll
I love you, man.
be cathartic here as we let out all of our emotions, joy, sadness, anxiety. We'll get into it all. What's really interesting about this film, Inside Out 2, that's the film we're obviously here to talk about. I actually meant to get into this on the main show. I wanted to at least maybe tease that I would talk about it, and we simply ran out of time because we ended up going into a massive rabbit hole on Pixar that I didn't fully expect.
Yeah, rankings, hot takes. It was basically a giant. It was a Pixar episode without us planning it being a Pixar episode.
Yeah, exactly. And it ended up being a Pixar buffet. We didn't really plan for that to happen the way it did.
Right.
So there were a few things that fell through the cracks. However, I guess it's appropriate because this is an Inside Out 2 exclusive.
Sure.
In the sense that I took my son to see this film. And the reason that is noteworthy is because Inside Out from 2015 is one of the best animated films ever made as far as I am concerned.
Yep.
It
I know you
was
said that before.
my number one film of 2015. I had it on number six on my list for best of the decade.
Yeah, I remember that.
Emphasize, because I did note this on the main show this week as far as hot takes are concerned. And yes, Inside Out is a mostly beloved animated film from Pixar.
Yeah, right.
I don't know many others that are that high on it as I am.
There are
which
different
is where-
levels of fandom
Yes.
and belovedness, if you want to call
Yes.
it that you certainly exceed maybe the usual threshold of Inside
exactly.
Out love.
It's not a hot take per se to be like, oh my gosh, Inside Out is a great film. Yeah, we all agree that it's good. There's varying degrees to your point as to where we land on that spectrum.
Yeah.
I am on the highest of highs. I think it was one of the very best films of the decade.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to regurgitate every single reason as to why that film worked for me the way that it did, but it was one of the most emotionally enthralling experiences I have ever had.
Oh, I know. For those who haven't heard me say this on the podcast before, JD and I saw that movie together.
Yeah.
And I said this on the main show just yesterday in episode 590. I think we saw the movie in 3D because that's all we could see it in, just given our times and everything. And your glasses were soaked. They were soaked. I felt so bad. There was a point where Bing Bong died. You couldn't even see the screen, I bet.
Well, that's interesting that you say that. It is a really moving moment. However,
it's the back end,
Bing
right?
Bong,
it's the final scene.
As far as that film goes, Bing Bong is like fourth on the list as far as the most moving scenes of that film for me. It's the one that people talk about the most.
Well,
and I certainly understand that.
Yeah.
But for me, it was the moment right before. It was Joy's epiphany as to her relationship with Sadness and why both of them are important for Riley.
Yeah, and I think that's why you were Yeah,
Yeah, that's what triggers me the most, especially when you couple it with Michael Giacchino's absolutely transcendent, beautiful score that is incredible in that film,
Well, yeah,
which
and the fact that Bing
leads to the
Bong,
big.
yeah, and the fact that they're so close together, it's like, okay, you already had this moment. It's like, oh, now you've got this on top of this.
Yeah,
It's,
exactly.
it's like I looked over at you. It's like, JD, I think I need to
Yeah,
get you a glass of water. You're probably
yeah, no,
dehydrated by this point.
it was exhilarating, and it's funny because I went back to listen to our top 10 year or our top 10 discussion for that year for 2015.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, I had this at number 1, and I was thinking about writing a few notes to maybe bring to this episode to lay out some context.
Sure.
And it felt a little, I don't want to say disingenuous, but I couldn't simply take one note or a few from my my monologue, I guess, like the way I articulated why I picked it as my favorite.
Mm-hmm.
I can just urge people to go and listen to it, because you'll hear the conviction, you'll hear my passion and the emotion come through.
Yeah,
Honestly, it's the best way for you to really experience why I think that film is so great, is to just go back and listen to that part of that show.
And at the risk of this episode not feeling like we forgot about that number 2 at the end of the title of what we're actually talking about here. We don't want this to turn into Inside Out 1.
Yes, exactly. But I did want to lay out that, because part of the response here, or maybe even part of my hesitation going into the film, is that's how high I am on that film.
Mm-hmm.
And there was no way Inside Out 2, as good as it may or may not be, was ever going to live up to that.
Yeah, and that's not a cynical thing to say, right? There are certain films that we all hold in such a certain emotional place for us that we know there's no way it can be topped, because we just have that specific relationship to that movie. And that's how it is for Inside Out for you. So yeah, I mean, and that's not to say you were doubting the success of Inside Out 2. It's to say that you knew that there was no way this was going to be your favorite Pixar film after seeing it.
No, absolutely not. But because of how much that film meant to me for a lot of reasons, what's ironic, I guess, about it is that I now get to take my oldest to see Inside Out 2 in theaters, and he is the age Riley was in that first film.
Right.
So the emotions that I see in him is something that I not only connect with myself and how I can relate to Riley, or having these emotions stirred up in all the ways we see in that film, but now I get to experience it through the lens of him as well. And then to take him to see Inside Out 2, which is a little funny, I guess, because he's probably about 3 or 4 or 5 years away from getting to the next level that we see in Inside Out 2. But just to have that next level of connection and getting to take Sam to see the sequel to this film that I love, it was just it meant a lot to me. It was a nice experience.
I think you're speaking to something that we might talk about when we actually get into our discussion of Inside Out 2. I think that's what makes the 9-year gap between release dates kind of interesting, because in actuality, it's only maybe 1 or 2 years in real time, in Riley time, right? Because in Inside Out 2, she turns 13, and I think she was maybe 11 in Inside Out 1, turning 12. So there's not 9 years between Riley 1 and Riley 2, right? But 9 years is a pretty good break between really young kids who may have seen that first Inside Out in 2015, who are now at a certain age where they can probably comprehend the more adult-related ideas that Inside Out 2 is getting into. So in a way, I think thematically, they are aging in the right way. Like the fact that you're taking your son to see this movie now, and even though he might be a few years behind Riley in this specific movie, I don't think that matters. I think he's gracefully aging with this film's thematic trajectory, which I think is pretty interesting.
Yep. And I very much look forward to talking about all of that. And I haven't even mentioned or teased the hockey stuff we're going to get into.
We're not going to be
And
reviewing Inside Out 2. We're going to be reviewing the hockey animated movie from Pixar.
and look, I cannot separate, and I don't think it should be, in all honesty. I understand that not everyone listening to this or watching the film is a hockey nerd like I am, which is fine.
Yeah,
Totally
that's fair.
understandable.
That's fair.
But the hockey, I do think, is a big part of this film. And I did not expect it to have the presence that it did.
Mm.
And fair warning, when we get to that part of the conversation, I am going to full on nerd out over the hockey.
This is going to
I'm
turn
gonna talk
into a
about
hockey
it quite
commentary from JD
specifically.
Durant. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. We've got diagrams, or JD has diagrams.
we're going to have a lot of fun, I guess, is the moral of the story there. So, with all of that laid out, are you ready to get into Inside Out 2?
You mean Pixar's hockey movie? Yes, I'm ready to get into it.
Pixar's hockey documentary, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is directed by first-timer Kelsey Mann. It, of course, stars Amy Poehler and Phyllis Smith. Joy and Sadness are back once again, as well as Maya Hawke, Lisa LaPera, Tony Hale, Lewis Black, Io Adibri, as Envy is new to the cast here. Adele X. Arcopoulos coming in here with a new character that I really love. And I don't think it's being talked about enough that Adele X. Arcopoulos has been tapped to do a Hollywood animated Pixar film.
Well,
I feel like that's noteworthy. And because I don't know if she's done anything
noteworthy,
Hollywood before, has she?
Well, not that I
don't
know
think
of,
so.
but I think, it's certainly noteworthy just given us as film fans who have seen her for almost a decade at this point, starting with Blue is the Warmest Color. So it's neat to see her here. But yeah, I can understand why she's not being as talked about, because her character of Ennui is probably the least consequential of the new characters in some ways. So I kind of get why, Maya Hawke's anxiety is really the talk of the town. It makes sense. It makes sense.
Yeah, and looking at her filmography here, at least on the film side, I don't know about television. I don't think she's done a whole lot of television.
Right.
But if this, what I'm looking at, is correct, this is her first foray into Hollywood.
All right.
She's done a bunch of stuff. I mean, she did the Ray Fiennes film a few years ago, but that wasn't a Hollywood production, but that was an English language film. So there was that. But outside of that, she hasn't. I mean, she's done a bunch of French films, obviously. I loved her in Wing Women last year. She was fantastic in that film.
Oh, yeah.
Of course, great in Passages last year as well. Love her as an actress, but yeah, it's really interesting and fun to see her. I know it's an animated film. We don't see her face.
But it's fun to see her in an American-produced movie that is shattering box office records.
Exactly. Like, I love it. Absolutely love that. So glad to see her in this film. There's, of course, a bunch of others that come and go throughout the film, including Ron Funches. Always love a good Ron Funches appearance. All right. So Inside Out 2, it follows, you're not going to believe this, Riley once again, this time in her teenage years, encountering new emotions.
Yep.
Love Pixar keeping that simple and brief and easy. All right, let's go ahead and jump into this. Brendan, what did you think about Inside Out 2?
Yeah, I feel like I was one of the cynical ones that thought to myself, much like Toy Story 3, why do we have this? At least with this, at least with Inside Out 2, I could sort of understand why, just given where Inside Out 1 ends, the whole allusion to puberty and the way puberty is introduced in Inside Out 2 is quite hilarious. There's a literal sign during the demolition scene that says puberty is messy, which I thought was quite hilarious. So I will say that I think Inside Out 2 does differentiate itself nicely from movies like Toy Story 4 and Finding Dory, by simply having a central premise that is enough to justify its existence. I think that's really the thing that saves this movie, is what it's getting at emotionally. No pun intended. Actually, pun intended, I should say.
Yeah, very pun
yeah,
intended.
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. When you say the word emotion in relation to Inside Out, it's always pun intended. I think that's rule number one.
Exactly. Yeah. It's
But,
like the opposite of Fight Club, where everything is intended here.
Everything is intended here. Yeah. Every pun intended when we say something emotionally speaking.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think the film's central premise is an interesting one. We'll certainly talk about it further as this conversation unfolds. But I just like how, in concept, what scared me the most was that this was from a first-time director. It also did not have Michael Giacchino coming back to do the score. We also had some of the core 5 emotions from the first film being recast, fear and disgust specifically. So it gave all of these signs that this could have been like a direct-to-video version of Inside Out that we've seen Disney do in the 90s and 2000s with some of their Renaissance films, right? And I guess to that point, Inside Out 2 is a surprisingly much smaller film when compared to its predecessor, despite having many more characters and a much bolder central idea. It's simply the day in the life of a teenager discovering emotional freedom, whose climactic battle is with an anxious version of herself. That's basically all this movie is. There's more to it than that I'm sure we'll talk about, aka hockey. But I do like the simplicity of it. I do struggle a little bit with how the film does function as a quote unquote movie. I don't know if it's fully as realized as Inside Out was, and we'll talk about it further, but maybe some of those direct-to-video vibes do come through, because this actually felt more like a 30-minute episode to a TV show than it does a 90-minute movie. And it's ironic that the movie is the same length as Inside Out 1, but so much happens at such a brisk pace here that it kind of felt more episodic in a way. And I'm still kind of struggling with whether that does the film any favors. And maybe we'll talk about that further. It's something I'm just kind of unsure about. But I will say, in the realm of modern Pixar sequels, I would certainly take this over Toy Story 4 and Finding Dory. I don't think it's as tight as The Incredibles 2. I think that's a very good sequel. But I like what this one's going for. And yeah, we'll talk about it further, because I'm interested in how this functions as a hockey movie.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. I guess to start off my thoughts here, to reiterate, I was equal parts excited to revisit these characters, but also hesitant because, as I noted, there was no way this was going to live up to the standard set by Inside Out.
Right.
And it doesn't live up to its predecessor, but I still found it to be a mature and natural progression of adolescence and the emotional complexities that develop as you get into your teen years. The idea that anxiety and envy and embarrassment and boredom are more prominent in your adolescence is the obvious evolution for Riley. And I think the film does a great job of demonstrating how your emotional landscape is not just more expansive, but more volatile. It doesn't quite have the same emotional impact as the first film. And narratively,
Agreed.
I'm with you. I don't think it's nearly as sharp, but I do admire the nuances it exhibits as one transitions into puberty and develops a wider range of emotions while still being clever and funny along the way. One of the funniest moments of the film for me is when Riley wakes up and her puberty alarm goes off, and the reactions from the emotion characters is really great.
Oh, I just love the idea.
That whole sequence is great.
I love the idea of the sensitivity of the console. Like that, just that simple idea, I think, is pretty clever.
It's fantastic. However, it's the transition to Riley's mom after Riley snapped at her as they were leaving the house, and she says, well, that's a preview for the next 10 years. I thought was an incredible line.
Yeah, which I knew was coming. I think the trailer gave that away, but somehow it was still very funny in the moment.
Oh,
It still got a chuckle out of me.
Yeah, all the stuff with Pouchy had me rolling. The clever world building and use of puns that we see in Inside Out is continued here as well. I absolutely do love. I was engaged with all of that. And yes, there is the hockey of it all, which truly, genuinely, I think is one of the best hockey films I've ever seen.
See, like
I've ever
This is
seen.
where I have a very specific question, and it might be an unfair question. And maybe I'll ask it later. Maybe you have more
Okay.
things to say before I get into my question, because
Yeah.
it's something I think you can ask about any movie that does something so right about a particular thing.
Yeah.
So I'm
just
just I'm curious.
yeah, I really do love that about this film. Inside Out 2 is first and foremost about Riley's lostness and journey to self-discovery, but channeling that through her experiences at a hockey camp, it was like this film was made just for me. And for reasons we'll get into, I'm not sure what your question is. Brendan did not reveal that to me beforehand, so
It's not
we'll
a big
see
deal. It's
where
a
it
very broad
goes.
question.
But I do think the hockey stuff here is really great, and it helps tap into much of the narrative and emotional turmoil that Riley goes through in a way that I found really, really compelling. So it doesn't quite have the power of Inside Out, but I still think this is a really good sequel that rivals some of the better sequels we've seen from Pixar in recent years. Not to Toy Story level, but certainly others for sure.
Yeah. So my question is, and again, I'm going to acknowledge it might not be a fair question, because I think it's a very broad question you can tailor to really any movie that's about something, but utilizes a certain physical thing, whether it be a sport or something music related. And maybe someone who is seeing that movie has a personal connection to that thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
If this movie didn't deal with hockey in that way, would that have affected your enjoyment of it? Like how much of the hockey is crucial to your enjoyment of this movie? Or do you think that what's going on around the hockey is still incredibly successful?
I still think what's happening around the hockey is successful. That's why I wanted to distinguish that the film is first about Riley's lostness and journey to self discovery, because that is primarily what is going on here. But funneling all of it through her at this hockey camp, I do think is something that I did find exhilarating for sure, and I do sense I'm very aware that it
Yeah.
tailors to someone like
Exactly.
me.
And that's why I wanted to ask.
I will say though, that question is hilarious to me because we've talked about this a couple of times in recent weeks, most recently on this week's main show, but we really dug into it further a few weeks ago with Pixar's recent announcement that they want to make broader stories that are universal and less about these quote unquote isolated singular perspectives.
These directors' autobiographies,
Yes.
as they called them, or something like that.
Exactly. Now, obviously, Inside Out 2 was made prior to these comments, but it is still funny to me because, in a way, and I think your question is very evident of this, Inside Out 2 really falls more into the former than the latter.
Oh, I was going to
Because-
say, this is very much Kelsey Mann channeling his relationship with his daughter, for one thing. So it's
Like, I don't know anything about Kelsey Mann and his relationship to hockey, but I will say this: hockey in North America is a niche sport. People might consider it to be one of the 4 major sports in North America, but in all reality, hockey does not come close to the likes of the NFL or the NBA or baseball, golf even. Formula One has become such a prominent thing. Soccer has taken huge strides in North America as well.
yeah.
Hockey is certainly on the lower tier, and it might rival sports like Formula One and soccer, but it is a niche sport, and so you can't really consider this to have the same universal appeal. Like, you just can't.
Exactly. It's going back to Pixar, and this is maybe where my relationship to certain things might play into this question that I asked you, because Pixar has delved with music as a symbolic thing in their movies before, specifically with movies like Coco and Soul. Now with
Yeah.
soul, it was tackling a very niche genre in jazz music, right? And the reason why I posed this question, because I thought to myself, these are two movies that utilize music in a way that is very much tailor-made for me. So a movie like Soul, I like less without the jazz, because like everything else around it, I don't think necessarily works. But then
Yeah.
I look at a movie like Coco. If I take the musicality out of that movie, sure, it suffers, but I still think it's a very good movie underneath that. So I guess in many ways, like what we're talking about here with Inside Out 2 working despite the hockey of it all, it might fit more into that Coco comparison, at least how it relates to me and my relationship to music.
Yeah. And it's a fair point to bring up, especially with hockey being as niche as it is. But I would argue that it works the same regardless. I do think hockey is something that can be supplemented here. If you replace it with basketball or soccer or any other sport Riley wants to take up, I think it works the same because it comes like it's about her inner core, which is a big part of this film. There's a new element to her mindset that Joy has developed over the last couple of years, where she's thrown out these embarrassing, awful memories to the back of the mind, quote unquote, the back of the mind.
Back of the mind. Yep, exactly.
Is a clever visual in the film. And she's created this identity tree that Riley clings to as far as who she is and the person she wants to be.
It's called the belief system.
The belief system, absolutely. And that has nothing to do with hockey.
Right, you're right.
And so the emotional volatility of this film, which is why I use that word very purposefully in my opening thoughts, that is what's most important here, and that doesn't change regardless of the sport. So you can replace it with anything. If your thing is soccer or baseball, you can simply pretend that's the thing Riley's doing and it all acts the same. And that's why I think the film ultimately works. Now, because it is hockey, that's what they chose.
Yeah.
Well,
so it's like okay, just cherry on top of a decent cake, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. And it all comes together regardless, primarily because of anxiety. And I mean the character of anxiety, not just the concept of anxiety as presented here as well. And I love the way that anxiety as a character is introduced, not just with the visual gags of her drinking, 6 energy drinks all at once. I thought it was a pretty clever sight, as simple as it was. But the film has a very bold and daring openness to the concept of anxiety in her introduction, saying things such as how she is there to help protect her from the things that she hasn't seen yet, which is very different from fear. And that is actually a quote that therapists use, if I'm not mistaken, to describe anxiety. So that's a very clever way of interweaving some actual psychological thought into this movie that doesn't sound like a lecture. So I appreciated that. And I also like that at first, anxiety overtaking Riley's mind for a few moments does weirdly kind of help her. Like it actually does put her in some decent situations. It's just when that bottles up and boils up and expands and expounds and attacks, if you will, that it becomes a problem. So I like that this is a film that doesn't utilize anxiety as a mustache twirling villain. So like there are some purposes if controlled correctly. So I think that there's a way that this movie handles that I felt was surprisingly kind of delicate, which I did not expect going in. I thought that introduction was really, really profound, and I really appreciated that.
I completely agree. And that to me is where the strengths of the film really lie, as much as I love the hockey stuff, and I do look forward to talking about that, but Riley's lostness and journey to self-discovery is the thematic and emotional thrust of the film, and I do think it's great. Obviously, it's contained to just a few days, but it does a great job of exhibiting the disorder and confusion and anxiousness you feel when your body starts to experience all these new changes, which is why anxiety is the perfect foe for this film, because it can often make us react in ways we normally wouldn't. And I do love how that is in contrast with Joy, as we see in those opening scenes, who has helped Riley establish these core beliefs that she is a good person who wants to do the right things, pushing all of her bad memories to the back of her mind. But anxiety isn't interested in being a good person to others as much as it's rooted in self preservation. And that creates this dichotomy in the film that I think is captivating, especially because we know Riley has a good heart. She isn't nefarious in her neglect of Grace and Bree, her two best friends that is established wonderfully at the opening of this film. But between her sadness that they won't be in high school together, that's a narrative through line that is established early on. That's not much of a spoiler. But
Right.
Grace and Bree are going to different high schools. And that leaves Riley in this state of sadness. So between that and anxiety taking control, as you were just talking about there, it's left her in a literal state of panic. And all she wants is for Val to accept her. She wants to make the team, of course.
Yeah.
But how can Riley do that and also be friends with her, with Grace and Bree at the same time? It's a polarity I think all of us can relate with in one way or another.
Yeah.
And how it crystallizes in those final scenes absolutely obliterated me.
Well, yeah, we'll talk about that.
It's the one moment where this film comes close to reaching the pathos of Inside Out from 2015. There's a line from Joy that seems to be resonating profoundly with a lot of people, including me, about how you feel less joy as you get older. It's a deeply poignant line on its own. But what follows is a series of events that viscerally slayed me, where Riley calls for joy. After anxiety lets go of the controls, so to speak, and Riley is able to gain some clarity, there's a great image of joy being called back to the control panel because Riley wants to go play hockey simply because she loves the game, because she loves the purity of the sport and just wants to be with her friends. I am 25 years older than Riley, but that's exactly why I play each and every week. These days,
That's why you
anxiety
should. That's why anyone should.
feels like it's swirling constantly, but every time I play hockey, I do feel like a kid again. So I connected with the film deeply in that regard. Again, I think the film works wonderfully on its own terms, separated from the sport. But my goodness, my attachment to hockey and how that is utilized here is still significant to how I reacted, especially because of how Riley overcomes that anxiety, brings joy back, and just goes out and skates and plays because she wants to feel that joy. Like I connect with that in profound ways. And the other big reason, my last note, and I'll let you kind of chime in here, it is the first and only time in this film when she goes out to skate simply for the joy of it that Michael Giacchino's presence is felt here. Where that theme, that joy theme that he created for the first Inside Out, it comes back in this moment. I nearly fell out of my chair.
I mean, that's rightfully timed from a musicality standpoint. It's a shame that the only time that the musical score really does work here for me is when it's calling back to Michael Giacchino. There's even a moment in the credits where it says original Inside Out themes by Michael Giacchino because it just has to reference that great score. And to be fair, the score here is merely passable at best, at least as far as the newer themes outside of what comes back from that first film, right? But I will, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I think where this film started to really take off for me is first the visualization of that anxiety attack, which I thought was surprisingly frightening. And for some context, I think this film, from an animation standpoint, I think was maybe the first time I started to notice Pixar maybe a little bit behind the times for once in the animation department. It's a very well animated film, but after the inventiveness of movies like Into the Spider-Verse and some of these other films, Pixar, I feel like, is a little bit behind for once. But that anxiety attack specifically, and the way it's visualized as a literal tornado, is really, really frightening. And I really responded to that. And I think what I like about the way it crystallizes too, to what you're talking about with Riley actually asking for joy in that way, it's
Mhm.
all about the idea of free will, because there comes a point in every child's life, really. I mean, age is just a number, but at some point in some child's life, they're going to develop this autonomy and not let their emotions be their guide, right? Not
Mhm.
be governed by their emotions. So it's interesting that a movie like Inside Out from 2015 was all about being content with not being happy all of the time. Whereas Inside Out 2 is about the ability to become happy when you want to. So it
Mhm.
could have, in the wrong hands, it could have easily been almost like a course correction to that idea from Inside Out 1, right? Where it could have easily felt like, actually, no, yeah, we'll make her happy. Just make her happy. But no, the idea that she has the ability now to make herself happy
Mhm.
is really the reason
And
why this works so well.
I completely agree. And that is not just a narrative trick. And I think that's where the brilliance of this as a psychological study, I think, is
Hmm.
honestly brilliant. Nothing short of
Okay.
brilliant.
Okay.
It
Okay.
was part of the conversation we had about the first Inside Out, in
Hmm.
that psychologically speaking, this is a quintessential vehicle you can show kids as to how, at that age especially, you engage with your emotions.
Hmm.
It is incredible how, and clever how, they
Hmm.
build that out in terms of the world building, where you have these personality islands. This is what makes up your core. These are how your memory works. And there's a lot of fun to be had. It's very
Yeah.
inventive.
Yeah.
And I love the visualization of all of that in Inside Out. And it is, any parent listening to this, your
Yeah.
kids are absolutely slaves to their emotions. They don't really have much of that autonomy.
Yeah.
And it's part of the maturation process as you get older. And I think
Hmm.
that's why including something like Riley's beliefs system, this new philosophical aspect to who she is and how that connects to her emotions, I think
Yeah.
is really great. Now,
Sure.
throughout much of the film, it is joy and sadness and those original emotions somewhat fighting against these new set of characters.
Hmm.
So you have joy and anxiety as representatives, I guess, kind of fighting for these new beliefs.
Hmm.
And at the end of the day, again, to Joy's very deeply poignant line, sometimes as you get older, you feel less joy. In that moment, that is Joy recognizing that she cannot control Riley anymore.
Yeah.
And it's something that anxiety also has to learn.
Yeah.
And it comes to obviously a dramatic moment where she has that panic attack. But that's ultimately the lesson learned, is that Riley now has some sense of autonomy.
Yeah.
And that
That's it.
comes
That's
through
it.
in puberty, it comes through in maturation and having these emotional complexities fighting off each other. But that is the next stage of evolution. That is like, to have that in the first film would have made no sense for where
No, I'm
Riley
with you. That
was
would have
at
just
her
rushed
age.
it. That would have rushed things too much. It
Absolutely.
made it too confusing, too overstuffed for its own good. Yeah.
Absolutely. Because I've seen some reviews claim that, oh, this is not that I want to fight these people. I don't. I just
Mhm.
disagree with the idea that this film is better or more complicated or nuanced because there are more complex emotions here. That first
No,
Inside
yeah.
Out needed to be limited because you're talking about a child who
Well, you're
hasn't
talking about
gone through that maturation process. It
yeah,
is going to be a little limited.
and you're
And
talking about a child whose emotions at that time are way more one-sided, right?
exactly.
The character of Joy specifically in that first Inside Out was genuinely happy a lot of the time. And
Yeah.
in Inside Out 2, the character of Joy, who's supposed to be joyful, she's not that happy most of the time.
Mhm.
So it actually showcases different sides of these emotions as far
Yeah.
as how they're supposed to function for Riley. Even Anger himself is not really all that angry in this movie.
Yeah.
So it gets away from the emotional one-sidedness of each of these
Yeah.
characters, which is purposeful in that growth.
And that's why I think it is, incredibly smart and inventive, maybe a little simplified, but again, going back to, I took my oldest to see this, and he's about Riley's age as we see her in the first film. And that is the stage of life that he's in. The emotions he expresses most prominently are joy and sadness and anger.
Yeah.
And
they're the easiest to decipher at that age.
they're very easy to decipher, and that's about all that's all he displays are those simplified emotions. He doesn't experience anxiety. He doesn't.
Yeah, he probably doesn't even know how to define that term yet.
Yeah, exactly. He doesn't really have embarrassment, as we see here. Maybe a little envy, but it's nothing that really controls his life. And he's sort of like all these new characters, he just hasn't really experienced in any real way. Now, in a few years, absolutely, he's going to have this moment. He's going to have this experience.
Did he enjoy this movie? Like, given that
he did, no, absolutely. Okay. I mean, Sam, he walks out of every movie thinking it's the best thing he's ever seen in his life.
I know. That's why I asked. He's becoming a great new critic. But I mean, like, given what you're talking about, that he's at a stage in life that he probably can't relate to the specificity of anxiety and envy. Yeah. But can he still enjoy a movie like this? It's not going above his head.
No, he'll watch this again in another 4 or 5 years, and he's going to have a different reaction to it. No doubt about it. He just can't quite relate to it as he can the first Inside Out. That's a film that he very much can relate to, for sure.
That's fair. That's fair.
And I think the two films do a great job as being complementary to each other, and how kids do evolve and the emotions that they do display. And because of Riley's belief system here and how that's established and how it leads to this autonomy that you're talking about there, if there's an Inside Out 3 or a fourth film, like, you're going to see more of that autonomy at play. And honestly, I think that is, as limited as it is, I do think that is what's great about the parental characters here.
Well, yeah,
even though
it
it's mostly played for laughs.
But it gives more context. It actually lets you to understand how that mind works more now.
Well, because in the parental minds, I do think that autonomy is very much there in those characters. Because is it the dad? I'm trying to remember, but there is a joke about how anxiety, or like at the end of the film, there's that gag about, how was hockey camp, and she gave like a 2-word answer, and the anxiety character was like, that's how it goes. Like,
but then started over guessing. Oh, what could this mean? What could this mean? But but I think like the idea of quote unquote suppressed emotions that this movie gets into, when that form of autonomy comes into play, that individualism comes into play, you still have most control over those 5 key emotions, and you can keep things like anxiety and envy in the back until they're needed, which is what answers the question of these parental minds. We've only ever seen the 5 of them. But no, actually the other ones are secretly there. These adults just know how to keep them at check more so than a child can. That's the whole point.
And that's it. Yeah, like this film teases that with the parental characters. And while I haven't seen Inside Out in a few years, I know we get some of the parental stuff there. I'd be curious to go back and watch that again in hindsight of this film. To see if that autonomy is consistent there. But I do think it is purposeful, at the very least in this film, that the parental characters do seem to have more control of their emotions. Again, it's mostly played for laughs here, but it does enough to suggest that if we do get to see Riley in future films as she matures and becomes an adult, that that autonomy is only going to expand. And she's going to be able to open up on her own suppressed emotions, or
Well, then
she'll be able to close them away all on her own.
it's probably going to lead to like a Toy Story 3 like scenario, as far as Andy and his toys sort of distancing himself from them now that he's grown up. It'll be Riley with these emotions where joy, sadness, and anger and all of them need to realize, okay, she actually doesn't really need us anymore. And from their perspective, that's where, if Inside Out 3 were to happen and it jumps ahead to that specific point in a child's life, that's probably the inevitable place where it would go. And not to say it should or shouldn't. I'm sure that could be a very moving story in its own right, but it seems to make sense, and this movie seems to be suggesting that.
Yeah, and I think what's great about the human experience, although this is a little bit of a tangent, but because we don't fully see it in this film, but the human experience is defined by the volatility of our emotions. We're such emotional creatures. Sometimes we can help it. Sometimes we do have that autonomy, and a lot of the times we don't as well.
Exactly.
We haven't really got to the hockey part of this, but I had my beer league game this last Sunday.
Yeah.
And I kind of joked about this at the beginning of the discussion on the main show when I brought it up, because in our game, emotions were out of control. Absolutely out of control.
Imagine.
There were fights galore. There was a huge scrum. Guys got kicked out of the game. It was nuts.
I mean, what was wasn't the score 1-4 until you tied it up and then won in overtime?
It was 4-1, but at a certain point at the end of the first or beginning of the second, something along those lines, just a huge scrum, guys really going at it, not able to contain their emotions at all. And I just find that hilarious that, yes, as adults, we do have a level of autonomy and we do mature and evolve, but because of how emotions simply have that ability to take control of the board, so to speak, it can still come out in a childlike way at times. Yeah. Which is, maybe what's interesting about bringing sports into this, because competitiveness brings out emotions.
That's where adults regress into children, right?
Exactly. Very much so. Which I just find
okay, so then
hilarious,
Inside Out 3 will be that point where Riley is able to say goodbye to those core emotions, that she doesn't need them as much anymore. And then Inside Out 4 is when she becomes a professional hockey player and then regresses back to her childlike mentality. And there's like, oh, we got to do this again. It's maybe that's where it'll go. It'll just be this giant arc.
It would, I would love to see that, but I do love how this film establishes not just her personality islands. We see that at the beginning of the film. They've changed a little bit, but a lot of some of what we saw in the first Inside Out is there. But now she has this belief system and these new emotions that she has to deal with. And at the end of the day, she kind of realizes that she has some, that autonomy is starting to kind of build itself there a little bit. However, I do think going from here, it's not as if she's going to be able to control her anxiety at every turn. We're
human. Not everyone can all the time.
Exactly. And I think that's why I love that line from Joy about, as you get older, you feel less joy. Not because joy is a thing that doesn't exist, but now it has to work or coexist alongside something like anxiety or envy all these other other things that we haven't experienced yet with Riley. As she gets older and becomes an adult, like sexuality is going to become a big part of it as well. And all these things that she hasn't had to deal with yet. But I love how it's starting to build those things, and there's a recognition with joy and sadness and all the original characters that they have to make room for all of these others, because that's part of the experience, and that's what makes
part of
Riley
the experience.
who she is.
And it's not just a childlike experience. Anxiety taking over as much as she does, her efforts lead to the result that is, quote, I'm not good enough. That's Riley's new belief. And that's not a childlike mentality. What makes we still feel that in our 30s and 40s and sometimes in our 70s, right? That's a universal belief. That's a universal belief. But the devastation here in Inside Out 2 is this is the moment that a child feels that way for the very first time. And
Exactly.
that's where I think it's most interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's compounded really well with Joy's arc in the film in terms of, trying to suppress these memories to the back of her mind. And the only way to fight the anxiety is to kind of let all of that loose. And symbolically, I think that's really interesting because it ends up morphing her personality or her belief tree, excuse me,
Yeah.
with all of these things. It can't just be a joyous belief, like a full-on optimism, because then you're obtuse to the reality around you and your
Right.
own experience. Your personality, your beliefs are a combination of everything you experience, including anxiety, embarrassment. Some of these bad
Because
memories
it's there to protect you.
are
It's there to
important.
protect
Yeah.
you simultaneously.
Exactly. So and how that's visualized in the film, again, at times it's clever, it's funny. I love the moment where anger tries to comfort and lift Joy as she's, kind of sulking and
Which is
in
not an
her own
anger
misery.
trait. Like I love that. Like these characters
great
have to
irony.
break away from
Yeah.
their core values, which is necessary, and that's something
Yeah.
that does happen.
Absolutely. They're on their way to find that personality tree that was thrown to the back of her mind. And on the way there, they go through a brainstorm, which I thought was kind of clever and funny.
That was that was a little obvious, but okay. I kind of
a lot of it's obvious.
A lot of it's
Yeah.
obvious. The sarcasm is pretty funny.
Yes.
And I did laugh at a lot of those things. But
Sarcasm.
yeah, I know that was pretty clever. That's something that did
I love
kind of
that,
match
yeah.
a lot of the things.
It's
in
a
the first one.
sarcasm. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I love that.
And also, sorry to cut in, but also
like
the voices and how they change when they're trying to yell across the sarcasm. And
I really wish the trailer didn't give that away because
I didn't see that. I'm glad I missed
saw it
that,
in the
yeah.
trailer. You were so lucky that you missed that. And I do like a lot of those bits. I do think a lot of those are pretty funny and pretty clever because I do think if I were to maybe throw a little bit of criticism at this movie, we haven't really criticized the movie all that much yet. It sounds like we're really high on it. I admittedly gave this film a 3 out of 5 on Letterboxd because I'm still wrestling with a few things. Really, the big thing I'm still wrestling with is the overall flow of that, that adventure-like narrative that Pixar films are known for. First off, I like that the core 5 kind of go on this adventure together. It breaks away from the usual 2-person pairing that Pixar likes to do for their formula. At the same time, while there are differences here, the flow of that adventure does feel very reminiscent of the first film. And maybe it's because they go to a lot of the same places, even though some of these places do look different now. I get that is ultimately the point.
Yeah, you want to explore more of the mind or the inside. Yeah.
There's still an element of deja vu to it that I don't know if it does the film all that many favors. And I think the film is aware of that because there is a new character named Nostalgia here that just simply makes you nostalgic for the first film. So I don't know if that works or if it's actually
but they kick her out.
on...
Like as soon as she shows up, they're like, it's not time yet. Like it's like there's like an inside joke there.
I can't tell if it's working for the movie or if it backfires.
I think it's great. Like I think the film is very aware of it for sure.
Yeah. And maybe that's the thing. It's like just the fact that the adventure itself is very reminiscent of that first film to me. I was a little bit distracted by the momentum of some of that stuff. And I kind of just wanted to get back to the whole anxiety stuff, which I did think was more interesting. So there's that. And I did mention earlier that the movie as a whole, even though it's about the same length as that first Inside Out, it kind of feels like a 30-minute episode. It moves very quickly. And that might be the point because this is ultimately a movie about anxiety. So it maybe is supposed to feel like it's on fast forward. Maybe that's where the Uncut Gems influence is coming in. Remember they made that note some months ago that Uncut Gems was a big influence on the making of Inside Out 2?
Yeah, I can see that. Sure.
That's the only time I can kind of see it, but otherwise I didn't really see it. It's just, it moves so quickly. And when it does pause for something more somber and more real, it does feel a little jarring to me. So I think there are some momentum issues as far as how it functions as a movie, even if I do, ultimately love what it is getting at underneath.
Yeah, I don't disagree that the narrative structure of the film is familiar, but here's the thing. They've wrote themselves into a corner. There's really not much you can do unless you're going to make an entire movie of them simply being there at the control panel. And I don't think that'll work for 90 minutes. You know, part of what made Inside
Unfortunately, you're
Out
probably right.
so clever and fun is experiencing the entire world that they created and going through something like abstract land that you see there, or, you know, like the thought,
Train of thought,
the train of thought, yes.
yeah,
Like all of that stuff was
Imagination
really great.
Land, yeah, Dreamland, all that stuff.
All that stuff was really fun. So if you're going to do a sequel, and again, maybe that's my reservation about them going back to this world, but through the conversation we've already had, I still like the trajectory, because human emotion does evolve and get more complex as you age and you get older. Once you get into adolescence, and we just talked about how if they do a third one when she goes into adulthood, there's still more to mine there. There's still more to explore. So I understand why they want to go back to this world, but structurally, unless you're going to simply have drama inside the control panel, you want to get outside and explore more of this world. And that will then render these films redundant in terms of getting us from A to Z. So they've wrote themselves into a corner. There's really not much they can do to get around that, I don't think. Although I'm not a professional screenwriter, so who knows? Maybe that's
the thing. I think
myopic comment, but
I think they try to get around that here by not only introducing these great concepts we already spent so much time talking about, but they do try to explore, let's say, Imagination Land with now a new lens. Even Joy acknowledges it looks different. It has changed since we've been here. So they do try to do that. I don't think they do it enough to take me into a new experience. Yeah. And that's really the only problem I have with it.
Yeah. And that's very fair. I don't wholly disagree, but I do think along the way, there's still a lot of fun to be had. I still liked the characters in peril, and you couple that with all the stuff with anxiety, which is really great. And I do love the addition of those characters, how anxiety takes control, how you talked about even initially, it seems as if it does help Riley out. But as I noted earlier, it creates this polarity as far as, do we want to be with Val in this new team? Well, if we choose that, we can't simultaneously want to be with our friends as well. And I do love that polarity here, and how it ends up leading to Riley having this panic attack, and how that is visualized is really great. How that is coupled with the characters of Joy and anxiety and them fighting back and forth is fantastic. And then it leads to that moment of her, overcoming anxiety and choosing joy.
Yeah.
And
it's a great idea.
Like, again, it's condensed to just a few days, but that whole idea of we're experiencing these new emotions, we overcome these challenges, and on the other side, there's a sense of autonomy that I never had before. Right. And sure, as Riley continues in her adolescence, that will still be a thing. That'll still be a battle she'll have to fight. But once she gets into adulthood, more of that autonomy will be there. And that'll lead to a third film if they want to go that route. And you can expand on that, especially when there's new elements to her life you can bring into it as she heads off to college or whatever they want to do. But
and she becomes a professional hockey player.
Exactly. Like I do think the flow isn't always seamless. And I also have some issues with, pacing, editing.
Yeah.
There's a few things here and there. I mean, but those are kind of small things. My biggest complaint here, aside from them writing themselves into a corner, it doesn't quite have the same heftiness of the first film. And I think part of that is going to be natural, because it's not joy and sadness at front and center. It's anxiety. And there's really not much about anxiety that's going to leave you going, man, I'm glad I experienced that. You know, because
well, I mean, that's kind of the point, though, right? It's,
that is kind of the point.
In a
which
way,
is,
like the fact you don't enjoy this movie might be that it's succeeding, right?
exactly. That's exactly what I was trying to get at. So,
Yeah.
I do think that does make the film a little successful. That's not necessarily, I guess, my biggest criticism, but I think it's a lack of a great score. I wasn't very engaged with the score at all.
It doesn't quite
And
have the same cinematic language as that first
it
film.
doesn't have any cinematic language, and when it does, it's Michael Giacchino's music that is doing that.
Yeah, and that's why I brought up earlier that I was a little bit concerned with how some of the animation looked here. And I should say that carefully because every Pixar film is beautifully animated, and this is no exception. It's a beautifully animated film, but I guess I wasn't as impressed by the animation when compared to even other recent Pixar efforts that I think are lesser movies than Inside Out 2. And I mean that in a way like with Elemental, for instance. I think Inside Out 2 is a better movie than Elemental, but there are things that movie is doing on the animation front that I'm sitting there thinking, wow, how did they pull that off? I never had one of those moments here with Inside Out 2. And maybe that's par for the course because of the more internal and introspective approach that this movie is prioritizing. Like I said, it is very much a smaller film when compared to its predecessor. So it's not as concerned with blowing you away visually. Yet at the same time, when we get to that vault scene and it is attempting to be a little bit more creative with, let's say, Pouchy, for instance, I couldn't help but sit back and think, man, I'm just reminded of what movies like Into the Spider-Verse and Puss in Boots: Last Wish were doing that were just so neat and inventive. And I feel like for once with this movie with Pixar, it's like they're trying to play a little bit of catch up on the animation front. And I just found myself thinking that a little bit. And maybe it's just the nature of this movie specifically being boxed into a corner that it was hard for them to take advantage of that a bit more.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't agree, but I will say this. It isn't trying to be as visually alluring as something like the Spider-Verse movies for sure. I do agree with that, but at the same time, I do think there is a remarkable level of detail to this film.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And some of that comes down to I guess maybe the world that they've created inside of Riley is a little contained, but even given those restrictions, I still think the colors pop really well, and I still think it's beautiful to look at. And we've got an hour here. I have done a really good job of holding back. I have not even talked about the hockey yet.
I was going to say, should we just transition to talk about hockey? Because that might take another hour.
The detail in the animation is astounding. It is really, really good.
I will say, to support that point, the one moment of animation that I really thought, wow, that looks good, is this memory avalanche that happens at the end. Which, on one hand, I sat back and thought, wow, that is probably the most egregious use of Deus Ex Machina in a Pixar movie I think I've ever seen. But I kind of laughed at that. But the visualization of how that avalanche and how that river, like how it riverizes, right? How it basically turns into a giant lake, I thought was pretty well done. So like that part I thought was pretty great.
Yeah. And even outside the hockey, I want to get to that here in a second, but I think of the anxiety stuff here, especially at the end.
Sure.
And
that tornado is great.
Does create this, I don't know, I guess this uncut gems kind of like I did feel a sense of anxiety when watching this. So I do think the film is effective in that regard. It never punches me like the first film did, but at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, like I don't think it's trying to either. So that might just be a personal thing more so than an objective criticism thing. But like I still think from a visual standpoint, all like that still works in terms of making the characters and the emotions we're supposed to be feeling. I think it is felt partially because of how it is visualized.
Yeah, I'm with you from an emotional standpoint. I didn't really shed any tear in any moment in the film, but that's not a bad thing. I mean, heck, even a movie like Wall-E, which is my second favorite Pixar film, I don't recall really ever crying in that movie, and I think that movie's amazing.
Yeah, and
It's the ability to make you ugly cry is not the criteria of a great
No,
Pixar film.
it's not.
It's not.
For sure. And,
yeah,
and
but
that's
yeah,
why, like, I want to articulate it's like the effectiveness of the film when it's there. I very much think it's there. I when I try to say that it doesn't quite reach me to the same levels, it's not just because anxiety is front and center and that joy and sadness are kind of more on the back burner here. It's just that it doesn't quite hit me in the same ways.
Sure.
And I think partially it's because of, the film writing itself into a corner, as we talked about. It's some of the pacing, and at times it is a little disjointed, but those are kind of small things that kind of lead up to another thing. I will also say this, the more I think about it, because I did really like this film. I think maybe much of that kind of comes down to the fact that the score here is very stale.
It's very
and
banal.
I didn't really like it all that much, because I guess I think about the film through the lens of the question you stated earlier, and that if you take out the hockey, does this still work? And I think it does. If you replace this score, let's say, with another great Michael Giacchino score, do I respond to this film more than what I did if everything else is the same? And my gut instinct is, yeah, I think I would.
That's
Like,
a great
I
point.
honestly, like, the more I talk about, like, and this is kind of a real time thing that just kind of came out of this conversation, because, I lay out my criticisms and I go, you know what? I think it really just kind of comes down to the score. I think that is my biggest complaint, because if that hits me in the same way, or in another way, but effectively the same way, I think maybe I do come away going, man, that was a different experience, but I responded just as heavily.
That is a really great point. We talk about movie scores a lot on this podcast. It's kind of our thing, right? We don't often talk about them as kind of a form of editing, right?
Yeah.
And I think you make a great point that if you take this exact movie as it's edited, and let's say hypothetically they gave it to Michael Giacchino to say, write a score for it. You have this film, it's already edited, it's 90 some minutes long, score the damn thing. And he comes up with something that sounds amazing. It's amazing how a great score just doesn't move you, but it actually completely recontextualizes a film's flow. It really does.
Yeah.
Like, the flow completely changes. And we don't often talk about score as a form of editing. It's very complimentary in that regard.
Absolutely. And maybe that's why, and maybe this is unfair because there's such a personal attachment to the scene, but it could help explain why that moment I talked about earlier, when Riley chooses joy and she goes out for a skate, when that joy theme comes in, it was by far the most impactful moment of the film for me, because it's the one time where you do have a score that can elevate the material.
Sure.
So like, I'm sure the moment would have worked great for me because of the emotions of it and the hockey of it all. But I sit here and wonder if it, instead of the joy theme, it was the normal music we had heard throughout the film, does it hit me the same way? I don't know. I'm a little dubious about that, to be honest.
That would be a great experiment. I want to see that experiment done. Someone rescore this movie with a better score, and does it change the experience?
Because I wasn't really expecting it, because Giacchino's themes were not in this film at all. So when she chooses joy and she goes out there and skates with her friends, and that theme kicks in, I nearly fell out of my seat. Like like, it really hit me hard. So like, honestly, I think a lot of it might come down to that.
Yeah.
I know we're going kind of long here. I do want to get to the hockey part of this.
Okay. You have diagrams. You have diagrams. I'm not kidding. You have diagrams.
And it circles back to the animation discussion we had earlier, because the style that Pixar goes for here, it is not as clever or wild as something like the Spider-Verse movies, but I still
Right.
love the level of detail. I love the clever intuitiveness that was established in the first film that continues here. And
Sure.
and it very much is a big part of the hockey as well.
Hmm.
And I think the reason why it works here is because it has conviction.
Yeah,
My
that's
biggest
fair.
issue with most hockey movies is that they're movies first and the hockey is very much secondary, and you can tell. Now,
Like
there
Mighty
are
Ducks. Mighty
exceptions.
Ducks.
Yeah, the Mighty
Yes,
Ducks
I
is the
had to
worst.
bring up the Mighty Ducks again. I am
It's
so sorry.
the worst example of that for sure. I do not like the Mighty Ducks movies because there is no reverence to hockey in those films. And it's something why I love Mystery Alaska. Is Mystery Alaska a flawed experience? Sure. I love it. I recognize the narrative issues there. But that is a film that has a deep reverence for the sport, a
Sure.
deep, deep love for the sport. And I think that is very much the case with Inside Out too,
Oh, I agree. I agree.
because
I could sense it for
it
sure.
comes through in the characters and the way they, the way we see them on the ice, but in the detail within the animation. So like the way these characters skate, the way they move, the mechanics of it all,
Yeah.
I think is incredible. It's really fantastic. The puck handling, the deking, the shooting, the opening sequence
Hmm.
of this film and the game-winning goal. This thread the needle moment,
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the hairs on my neck stood up. It was
Well, see, like
absolutely
this is not a
fantastic.
surprise. This is not a surprise for Pixar, right? Because we talked about this before, and I think we even mentioned this on episode 590. So for those who listened to that episode, apologize if this is just us regurgitating something we already said there. But Pixar is very much known for looking at the little details to get those little details right, depending on
Mhm.
what that thing is. So in this case, with Inside Out 2, it's getting the details of hockey right. In the case of
Mhm.
a movie like Coco, it's getting the musicality right. As a musician, I'm sitting there watching someone play the acoustic guitar, and I could see by their left hand, oh, that is a D chord, and I could tell by my relative pitch that that is in the key of D. So
Mhm.
I could see the fingerings are right. So they did their homework. Apparently, when they made
Yeah.
Ratatouille, they had real rats on set watching their movements to get the movements right.
Yeah.
So, if anything, this just continues the ethos of Pixar in
No,
getting those
yeah,
details right.
absolutely. And they do get the details right. I love this threading the needle moment. It's
Hmm.
it's a great moment that works for the cohesion of those three characters, friends on the ice, and how they work together.
Right.
This is an absolutely fantastic moment, and I do love the details here. Again, the mechanics, the skating. It is, of course, amplified to a Pixar level, but the
Mhm.
mechanics are true to form,
Yeah,
and they
absolutely.
don't overdo it. It's not overly cartoonish. There is a sense of realism as far as a
Mhm.
Pixar movie can go, anyway, that I
Sure.
really deeply admire. So you very much get it here. Like this is the awe-inducing moment that comes with this sequence.
Yeah.
Now I want to talk about this one. For those on YouTube, for our audio listeners, you need to go to
We
YouTube to
apologize.
see
We
these.
apologize.
Like I'll do my best to describe these, but you can also go to YouTube to watch this. So this is a goal where Riley scores. Okay.
Hmm.
And what I love a couple of things about this. Now, I took this screenshot in the middle of her shooting, and you can tell because the puck is kind of there in the middle of the frame.
Yeah.
The little
Yeah, I can
blurry
see that.
black thing. But when you look at the goalie, and I mentioned this on Twitter, but in case you missed it, I freaking love this. Now, I played goalie my entire life until I got hurt. So, looking at this as a goalie, this is fantastic. So, she is going down to the butterfly. You see the pads are in perfect position. The blocker is up. The glove is in the right spot. She's square to the shooter. there is nothing this tender could do any differently. Riley just scores this goal because she's a great shooter. Now, it is a breakaway, so she's right in front of the
So
goalie.
she has the
There's no
edge, yeah.
defense to help her out.
Yeah.
But in terms of just facing off against the shooter, she's square, she's not moving. Like, this is a level of detail that you can't do accidentally. You can't. This took someone to know what they're doing. And then I took another screenshot. So this is after they scores, after she scores, you can see that the netting kind of had moved. And again, like the way the blocker is, the way the right pad is extended, that is true to form. That is someone that took the time.
That's amazing. That's
to
amazing.
Watch how goalies move, especially at that age, because we're talking about youth players, and rendering it in a manner that has a sophisticated level of detail. This is not simple animation here. As far as the hockey goes, you can debate all the other stuff all you want.
Yeah, I will agree with you on the hockey. Yeah, I would. And it's more so the detail itself, and maybe like the wow factor is that the level of detail is accurate. It's the accuracy of it that we have to applaud. Because it clearly showcases that they did their research, and I will compliment them on that.
And the other thing too, I love about going back to this second screenshot that I have here. I love the ice. I love the ice kind of coming off of her skate there as she leans into it, because she's putting weight onto that right leg in order to get power into her hips and into her shot. So
she's adjusting accordingly. She's prepping accordingly.
Yes. So you see the ice on her right skate, because the left one is in the air, obviously, because she's putting all her momentum into her stick. So the ice around her right skate is coming into the air because her right edge would have hit the ice at such an angle that it would have spit out.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they include that in this shot. Like, that is incredible. Like that's what I mean. Like, if you're not looking for it and you don't know why, you're not going to see it. Like, they could have excluded that. No one would have known or cared. But of course, the fact that it's there is wild to me. Like, that's great. Because that is a level of detail that they put into this. It's extraordinary.
Well, yeah, and like I said, they've done that in their music films too. I sit back and watch the main character in Soul play the piano. It's like, yes, that's a jazz chord. I know it is. Didn't have to be, but it was. Yeah. So same principle applies here. So I appreciate their level of detail in their research.
Exactly. And it's why, like, I love the sequence when Riley goes out there and practices early in the morning, gets to the rink before everyone else. Like, that whole sequence is rendered beautifully as well. And again, it's the skating, the motion of shifting from side to side, and all of that is fantastic. The shooting and how all of that works mechanically, it's really great. And so the film had built up trust in that regard. I would have responded either way. There's no doubt about it. But the fact that they built it up in such an authentic way, that when Riley goes to the penalty box for completely bodying her friend, by the way,
I know
forget which friend it was.
I think it was it Grace? It may have been.
I think it was Grace.
Yeah.
She completely destroys Grace and just body checks her to the ground. Honestly, it was a good check. Like, I know she went to the box for it, but
I know, but it was true to form though, right?
It was true. Like, you could argue it was a little dirty. But
hockey's a dirty sport.
I don't want to say dirty, but it's physical. It is a physical sport.
It's perceivably dirty.
I think you could argue it was a clean hit. Now, at that point, she had been playing pretty selfishly, and you could argue that her getting to that moment was completely unnecessary because she wasn't utilizing her teammates at all. Really, she goes to the penalty box for being a selfish brat, more so
Yeah,
than
which
the,
is
than
which,
the,
which
than
is
the,
which is
than the
you know,
hit.
earned.
which is very much earned. And then she goes into the state of panic. So it all works cohesively with the emotional and dramatic through lines of the film, as we talked about earlier. But that's
Right.
where, like, when she comes out on the other side of that panic attack and she's like, you know what? I love this game and I just want to skate with my friends.
Yeah.
I had such a deep visceral reaction to that. That is, it is absolutely on par with how I responded to Inside Out, the first film. So
With
the
of course
rest of the
Michael
film doesn't
Giacchino
quite get
helping the
there.
way.
Yeah, exactly. Giacchino
Yeah.
helping a lot of that for sure.
Again, maybe another experiment. Replace that scene with a
Yeah.
new score that doesn't work nearly as well. How does
Yeah.
that scene hold up?
Exactly. I
Yeah.
think it's a fair question to ask for,
Yeah.
at any rate. But
Anyway,
I
that's a
love the
long
hockey.
way of us saying with regard to Inside Out 2, just better score, better movie.
Mhm.
That's
I like the
the
film.
ethos of it.
I liked it. It doesn't quite reach the heights of top tier Pixar, but as far as Pixar sequels go, I do think it is one of the better ones. I would absolutely take it over Toy Story 4. I would take it over either of the Cars sequels. I would take it over Monsters University.
Of course,
over
Finding Dory.
Lightyear,
Yeah,
Finding
over Finding
Dory.
Dory. Have you tried ranking this in all 28 of Pixar's films yet? I'm not sure if you've done that
No,
exercise yet.
but let me see if I can pull them up real fast because I think I have it up here from the other night.
Oh yeah, yeah. When we
Okay,
did that
so
simultaneously.
looking at my list here, I think I would have this at number 14, right behind The Incredibles 2.
Okay. I think.
Although, actually, now that I'm looking at this list, I think I got to rearrange some of it because I probably would put The Incredibles 2 slightly higher. But,
Yeah, I have Incredibles 2 at number 10 or 11, give or take. I will admit, after our conversation yesterday, I do realize a movie like Coco is one I need to revisit because
I do too, yeah.
I really liked it when we saw it, but I didn't love it. Yet for some reason, it's a Pixar film that has weirdly stayed with me in all of this time, which means I'm probably going to like it a lot more. At least I'm anticipating that I will. So at this point now, I think I have Inside Out 2 around number 15, just above movies like Soul and Brave and A Bug's Life and Elemental and Toy Story 4. At least that's how the current ranking is. I have it just behind Monsters Incorporated and that first Toy Story and Finding Nemo, Incredibles 2 and whatnot.
And while our ranking is slightly different in that regard, but it's the same films but slightly ranked. So I think we're talking around the same page.
I think we are.
Yeah, because as we talk here, honestly, I think I would move at the very least until I wrestle with this more. I would move The Incredibles 2 up to 12, and then put Inside Out 2 at 13. I'd have it at 13 right now.
Okay. All right. So then we're pretty close in our overall ranking of the film, even though it sounds like you may have liked the film a little bit more than I did.
Yeah.
I'm actually surprised.
I think I talked myself into giving it another half star, to be honest.
Well, I kind of did too. I think before I got on this conversation with you, I think I may have had Inside Out 2 somewhere around like 17 or even 18, but then I decided to push it up primarily because I got to admit, a movie like Soul was so tailor-made for me that it has become probably the most frustrating Pixar film in many ways.
That's fair, yeah.
The whole body swap aspect of that movie is among the worst things Pixar has ever done in any one of their movies. Like it is so bad. It is so bad. And it makes me kind of hate that movie because of it. And that's so unfortunate. Like that's a movie I should like more, but Inside Out 2, while I don't think it's as smooth of a movie as maybe something like maybe Elemental, for instance, I think it has more of a boldness on its mind. And the fact that that boldness is crushing the box office, that is cool to see.
I think it's very cool to see as well. I'm with you. And honestly, as reserved as I was going into it, it won me over in the sense that if they want to make a third one, I'm open. I'm ready for it. And
we'll be open for one reason: Michael Giacchino.
I agree. Or bring someone in that can do, that can bring a personality to it. And I want to be, I guess, a little fair because I don't really know much about this composer.
Andrea Dotzman.
Andrea Dotzman. Yeah,
I was just looking up her name as well, and I'm going to her IMDb page, and her compositions are very limited. It's mostly short films. When she's worked with Pixar, it's only been stuff from Doug Days, the TV show, the Up spinoff show on Disney Plus. So she hasn't really had much work in, let's say, fully composing a movie, but she's worked on music departments for movies before. So it does feel like an inexperienced composer in some ways.
Yeah, I agree. And look, it's I don't know anything about her. It's obviously nothing against her personally, but I just found it to be really dull and stale, and I was not moved by it all that much. I truly think after this conversation, I did not really have this in my notes coming in. But after we found it. I think we found it. That to me, if you swap that out with something much more compelling, I think I really do dig this film way more than I did coming out of the theater.
But we found a good topic here, right? Just an overall general topic and how musical scores can function as a form of editing.
It can make a big difference. It makes a big difference.
We should have that as a topic on the show someday.
We should, absolutely. Yeah. At any rate, I know we're going long here, so I think we can go ahead and end it there. I really like the film. I love the Hawke of it all. It really, really compelled me. I love the detail of it, and that moment of joy being called, her going out there, it will easily go down as one of my favorite scenes of the year. Hands down.
That's good to hear. Good to hear.
So, if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say, if you're watching on YouTube, please leave a comment below. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, reach out to us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Let us know if you agree with anything we had to say or disagree.
Absolutely.
You can email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com. Well, we talked about it a couple of times on this week's show, episode 590. We do talk quite a lot about Pixar.
Yep.
So you can go and check that out. We, of course, continue our Best Picture movie series talking about Gentleman's Agreement, also a fascinating conversation. Please go and check that out. We'll have another review for the film Tuesday, but it'll probably come out this Thursday. So it'll be Tuesday on a Thursday. So go and check that out as well.
Not even recorded on a Tuesday.
Not even recorded.
We
and
hate
I
the
saw
day
it
of
on
Tuesday.
a Saturday. So, yeah.
So basically the most misused title for any film.
At least for us
this year. Yeah.
No, at least for us, for sure. At any rate, we'll have that as well. I guess that will do it. Brendan, do you have any final thoughts before we get out of here?
I really want to try this experiment. I want to see someone do this. I want to see someone take Inside Out 2 and maybe edit Michael Giacchino's score from the first film in some way within it and see what that does. I'm not saying it's going to help. And plus, that's the wrong way to do it. You have to really compose it properly. But if it gets closer, that'd be a fun experiment to see if that justifies our thoughts.
I agree. I mean, I'm sure there's cues that you could take from the first film and try to fit it into at least some of the scenes. Maybe not the film on a whole.
Well, yeah. Admittedly, I knew musically Inside Out 2 was off to a bad start when the opening logos for Disney and Pixar opened the movie, which do utilize the main theme from Inside Out, but they're down at least a full step. Like, it sounds different, and that makes it sound like it drags almost. Because for those of us who love that film, that score in that specific key is kind of engraved in our minds. So to slightly change it a little bit to open up the film, already it took me out of the movie. So it was off to a bad start musically.
No, I think that's perfectly fair. I like the cue enough that it got me wound up for the film, but it was disingenuous because it got me amped for a score that was never going to be there until the end.
It was a bait and switch, even if it wasn't
very
a
much a
successful
bait and switch
for me.
Yeah, absolutely. We didn't really talk about it a whole lot, but before we get out of here, I want to emphasize. In fact, I'm going to bring down the music here because I really want this to be noted.
Mm-hmm.
I love the voice cast here. We didn't really talk about these performances.
We didn't. You're right.
Amy
That's a good
Poehler, I think, is fantastic as Joy. I loved her so much. Her and Phyllis Smith, I loved so much in Inside Out. I nominated them for acting categories at the In Session Film Awards that year.
Right.
I think they're that good. And I think they're absolutely wonderful here. Once again, Maya Hawke is fantastic as Anxiety. She absolutely nails it out of the park.
I agree.
Absolutely fantastic. Lewis Black will always be perfect for Anger. He's great. Io Adibri as Envy. She isn't as prominent in the film, but when Envy's there, I like what Adibri brought to the role.
A lot of the new characters outside of Anxiety are really there to help push the plot for Anxiety along. Like they're not really there to have much of a emotional purpose, pun intended. But for what they're asked to do, at least the actors are at least trying to do something and give them personality.
Yeah. Well, except Embarrassment. Embarrassment has a little bit of a role and a personality.
Right.
In which Paul Walter Hauser voices Embarrassment here, although I think he really only has one line in the film.
Oh, it's mostly just grunts.
It's mostly just grunts. Yeah, but there's at least a quirkiness to the character. You noted earlier that Adele Exarchopoulos doesn't have as much to do either. But again, when she does have something to do, I found myself very compelled by it. Like, I loved her snarkiness.
When she freaks out over losing her phone, I thought that was really funny.
It's so good. Yeah. Like, I do really love that a lot. So, I thought the cast here was fantastic. All the stuff with the parents really made me laugh a lot as well. Yang Ye, I'm not sure if I'm saying that, as Lance Slashblade, this anime character or video game character, I thought was great.
That was
goofy, extremely.
That was
goofy,
strange.
But
That was strange.
Love that. Pouchy, MVP in a lot of ways. So, I really like the vocal cast here. I just wanted to shout them out because
good. I'm glad you did.
Fantastic. Yeah,
I'm glad you did that.
At any rate, that will really be the end of it.
We're done. We're done. We went long here.
Exactly. So again, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us here to the end. We really do appreciate it. Go watch Inside Out. It's an awesome movie. And actually, one last thing on the voice cast. Kendall Coyne Schofield, who voices the hockey announcer here, is a professional women's hockey player.
Of course,
cool little tidbit.
Of course, she is. Yeah, I mean that's the Pixar magic in detail, right?
Yeah, gotta love that as well.
Yeah.
All right, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time on the In Session Film Podcast. The hockey in this film is awesome. It is so good.
It's in Mystery Alaska, right?